Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents If We Are Striking for Pennsylvania, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac March to Gettysburg, Volume 1, June 3 through 21, 1863, by Scott L. Mingus, Sr. and Eric J. Wittenberg, narrated by Paul Heitsch. Forward. Elated that the Army of the Potomac had finally achieved a victory against the heretofore seemingly invincible General Robert E. Lee, soldiers in Major General George Gordon Meade's army immediately cast the Battle of Gettysburg as one of the war's most defining conflicts. "The great battle of the war has been fought," declared Elisha Hunt Rhodes, an officer in the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry. "And thanks be to God, the Army of the Potomac has been victorious at last." Days after the repulse of Pickett's charge, a headline in the Philadelphia Inquirer proclaimed, "Waterloo eclipsed." 4 months after the battle, President Abraham Lincoln traveled by train to Gettysburg to dedicate the soldiers' national cemetery and to articulate a vision for a new birth of freedom. Although the Civil War would continue for 2 more bloody years, the battle at Gettysburg had emerged as a crucial moment in the war's trajectory. During the post-war years, as Gettysburg transitioned into a landscape of reconciliation, Union and Confederate veterans returned to the battlefield to mark the positions of their respective units and to dedicate monuments. Through the deliberate efforts of John B. Batchelder, the battle's first historian, Gettysburg became the high watermark of the Confederacy, and indeed a battle that both Union and Confederate veterans labored to interpret as the turning point of our nation's most defining epoch. While contemporary Civil War scholars continue to debate the importance of Gettysburg as a turning point in the Civil War, the battle's place in America's collective consciousness is solidly entrenched. Each year, the National Park Service records roughly 1 million visitors to the battlefield. Students of the engagement are afforded no shortage of books, scholarly articles, and popular essays on the campaign and 3-day battle. We accept it as a truism that more books have been written about Gettysburg than any other Civil War battle, or indeed any other battle in American history. Putting quantified specifics to such generalizations makes the sheer amount of attention and output devoted to this campaign all the more staggering. A search on WorldCat, a global database of library collections, reveals that approximately 18,000 books have been written on Gettysburg, the campaign, and associated events. Allotting for some concessions in the search, duplicated titles in electronic and print versions, for instance, theses and dissertations, or books targeted for a juvenile audience, a book on Gettysburg has been published roughly every 3 days since the end of the Civil War. Scholarship on Gettysburg is rich and dynamic, but at times also niched and gratuitous. In addition to the full-length monographs on the campaign, historians have analyzed specific parts of the fighting, with Pickett's charge still holding powerful persuasion. Moving beyond operational or tactical inquiries, historians have authored a diverse and extensive array of studies. Students of the battle benefit from studies ranging from biographies on some of the battle's personalities, to field hospitals, to works on the impact of the battle on the town's civilians, or the tenor of Union and Confederate veteran reunions. Others have filled a niche in authoring guidebooks on the battle's actions and map collections. Paralleling more recent trends in Civil War memory, historians have widened the lens beyond July 1–3, 1863, to examine how the battle and battlefield have been preserved, interpreted, and commemorated. It is tempting, then, to ask, do we need another book on Gettysburg? Or, as importantly, Is there anything left to say about this campaign and battle that has not already been said? Years ago, as a doctoral candidate at Auburn University studying 19th century American history with a specialization in the Civil War, I frequently reflected on that question. By the time I began to write my dissertation, I had already spent 6 summers working for the National Park Service at Gettysburg National Military Park as a seasonal interpretive park ranger. Like thousands of others, I had become fascinated with the battle, its history, and the men who fought and died on those hallowed grounds. Thanks to my work with the NPS and my academic training, I had developed an intimate familiarity with the masses of primary sources and the scope of the secondary literature devoted to this battle and its participants. When I proposed a dissertation, a culminating product of original scholarship that makes a meaningful contribution to the historiography, on the Gettysburg battlefield, I expected that my proposal would be greeted with a degree of skepticism. My dissertation, which became my first book on a great battlefield, demonstrates that there are elements of the Gettysburg battle and its history yet to be excavated. If we are striking for Pennsylvania, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac marched to Gettysburg June 3 through 22, 1863. The first of 2 volumes by Scott L. Mingus Sr. and Eric J. Wittenberg is a masterful overview of the Gettysburg campaign that skillfully demonstrates that, yes, we do need another book on Gettysburg. Collectively, Mingus and Wittenberg have authored or co-authored more than 40 books on the Civil War. Individually, their previous scholarship has successfully reminded us that there are new dimensions of the campaign and the Civil War in Pennsylvania to explore. Fewer people would be better positioned or qualified to produce such a magisterial study. Scott Mingus is an award-winning author whose impact in uncovering particular facets of Pennsylvania's Civil War history garners wide appeal. Eric Wittenberg, also an award-winning author, is a distinguished authority on Civil War cavalry and an influential voice in battlefield preservation. Both are coveted public speakers who share their Civil War expertise and passion with a multitude of audiences across the nation. In If We Are Striking for Pennsylvania, Mingus and Wittenberg offer the most comprehensive study yet produced of the events leading the Union and Confederate armies to Gettysburg. This study offers more than a predictable recounting of the movements of the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac between June 3 and July 1. However, the result of their thorough and extensive research is a narrative replete with an impressive array of perspectives and voices. Listeners will experience the campaign through the eyes of an assortment of Union and Confederate soldiers in the rank and file, as well as those in the officer cadre. Traditionally, the campaign to Gettysburg is relegated to a narration of the movement of the opposing armies. Mingus and Wittenberg widen the lens of the theater of operations and address the function of a multitude of commands, including Major General James Adam Dix and the Department of Virginia on the peninsula and Major General Robert Schenck's federal troops in Baltimore, Maryland. Additionally, Mingus and Wittenberg also consider the interplay of military operations and politics, integrating perspectives from politicians in both Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, as well as Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The result of this approach is a clarion reminder that military operations never occur in a vacuum. Mingus and Wittenberg have been deliberate in their previous scholarship to consider the war's impact on civilians. This approach echoes in If We Are Striking for Pennsylvania. The authors explore the impact of the movement of the armies upon the civilians, particularly those in south-central Pennsylvania, after the Confederates penetrated across the Mason-Dixon line. Listeners will find much value in this study. Devoting a chapter to each day of the campaign, listeners can follow the movement of both armies to Gettysburg as well as the events unfolding with other military commands in the wider region, the impressions of politicians, and the reactions of civilians. A plethora of maps and images complement the narrative. The order of battle, Appendix A, underscores the author's meticulous research and offers the most comprehensive order of battle yet assembled for June 30, 1863. If We Are Striking for Pennsylvania is more than another addition to the 18,000 books already written on Gettysburg. With the background and experience of a seasonal NPS ranger at Gettysburg for just shy of a decade, and as a Civil War scholar and academic, I am confident in anticipating that Scott Mingus and Eric Wittenberg have produced a study that will rise above the masses of Gettysburg books. Indeed, this title is destined to stand as the definitive treatment of the opening phases of the Gettysburg Campaign. Dr. Jennifer M. Murray, Department of History, Oklahoma State University. Prologue. The Battle of Chancellorsville, May 1 through 5, 1863, was one of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's greatest victories. Outnumbered more than 2-1, Lee defeated Major General Joseph Hooker's Army of the Potomac with only part of his Army of Northern Virginia present, about 61,000 men. 2 of Lieutenant General James Longstreet's 3 divisions were on detached duty around Suffolk, Virginia. Hooker opened the campaign with a brilliant march that turned Lee's left flank, but the Union commander lost his nerve and ceded the initiative to his opponent. Lee's audacious streak came to the fore when he boldly divided his understrength army. With just 15,000 men to hold Hooker in place at Chancellorsville, Lee sent the rest of his army under Lieutenant General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson on an unlikely 17-mile flank march. Jackson's assault crashed into and rolled up the Army of the Potomac's right flank. After a bloody day of fighting on May 3 that united the wings of the Southern Army, Hooker, likely concussed by a blow to the head when an artillery shell struck a pillar on the porch where he was standing, assumed a defensive posture. More fighting followed on May 4 and 5. Hooker ordered his army to retreat, and by May 6 it was over. The Army of the Potomac returned to its winter camps around Falmouth, Virginia. Lee's victory at Chancellorsville came at a high cost. Stonewall Jackson was seriously wounded in a friendly fire incident on the night of May 2 in a heavily wooded area. Soon thereafter, Jackson's senior division commander, Major General Ambrose Powell Hill, was also lightly wounded, leaving Lee's cavalry commander, Major General James Ewell Brown, Jeb Stuart, in temporary command of Jackson's 2nd Corps. Jackson's death from pneumonia on May 10 left Lee without a trusted leader for half of his infantry. Stuart had performed admirably in an unfamiliar role, but Lee could not spare the gifted cavalryman from his important duty as the eyes and the ears of the army. In other words, Stuart was not a permanent solution to the problem created by Jackson's absence. Lee had long realized that 2 large infantry corps were unwieldy, and he took the opportunity brought about by Jackson's untimely death to change the structure of his army from 2 infantry corps to 3. Longstreet would continue to lead his 1st Corps, but Lee split off portions of it and of Jackson's former 2nd Corps to create the new 3rd Corps. A.P. Hill, whose wounds were not severe, was the logical choice to command one of the corps. He had successfully led Jackson's largest division for about a year and had a reputation as a fearless fighter. Lee promoted Hill to lieutenant general and assigned him to the 3rd Corps. The issue of who would command the 2nd Corps, and thus who would step into Jackson's shoes, remained an open but important question. Major General Richard S. Ewell had performed exceptionally well in command of an infantry division during Stonewall Jackson's 1862 Shenandoah Valley campaign, but had not been with the army since suffering a wound that cost him a leg 9 months earlier during the early hours of the Second Manassas campaign. Whether the terrible injury would change Ewell, and whether he still had the stamina to serve in the field after such an injury, was unknown. Left without any viable alternatives, Lee arranged for Ewell's promotion to lieutenant general and appointed him to command the now smaller Second Corps. Defeating Hooker at Chancellorsville allowed Lee to seize the initiative for the summer campaigning season, and he promptly began planning another invasion of the North. His first attempt had ended in failure at the Battle of Sharpsburg, Antietam, the previous September, and he longed for a second chance to change the war with a major victory on Northern soil. After Major General Ulysses S. Grant's army crossed the Mississippi River that May and hemmed in Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton's Confederate army inside the defenses of Vicksburg, Mississippi, President Jefferson Davis invited Lee to present his plan to the Confederate cabinet on May 26. The Confederate High Command convened a series of meetings in Richmond to discuss the next move. After 3 days of intense debate, Lee persuaded the leadership to support his suggestion. Lee's opinion, reported Confederate Secretary of War James A. Seddon, naturally had great effect in the decisions of the executive. Lee explained the rationale for his daring plan in his post-Gettysburg report. The position occupied by the enemy opposite Fredericksburg being one in which he could not be attacked to advantage, it was determined to draw him from it, he reasoned. The execution of this purpose embraced the relief of the Shenandoah Valley from the troops that had occupied the lower part of it during the winter and spring, and, if practicable, the transfer of the scene of hostilities north of the Potomac. Lee believed the corresponding enemy movements might offer an opportunity to attack Hooker. In any event, moving his Southern army north would compel the Army of the Potomac to leave Virginia and perhaps draw troops to its support from other parts of the country. In this way, he rationalized, it was supposed that the enemy's plan of campaign for the summer would be broken up, and part of the season of active operations be consumed in the formation of new combinations and the preparations they would require. In addition to these advantages, it was hoped that other valuable results might be attained by military success. A northward thrust would serve a variety of purposes. First, it held the potential of relieving federal pressure on the beleaguered Vicksburg garrison. Second, it would provide the people of Virginia with an opportunity to recover from the ravages of war and a chance to harvest their crops free from interruption by military operation. Third, it would draw Hooker's army away from its base at Falmouth, giving Lee an opportunity to defeat the Army of the Potomac in the open field. Finally, Lee wanted to spend the summer months in Pennsylvania in the hope of leveraging political gain such an incursion might bring about. In President Davis's perspective, the main purpose of the movement across the Potomac was to free Virginia from the presence of the enemy. If this could be done by maneuvering merely, a most important result would be cheaply obtained. Postmaster General John H. Reagan vehemently opposed the plan, or at least he argued as much in his memoirs. He believed that Lee favored such a campaign because he believed he commanded an invincible army which had been victorious in so many great battles, and in all of them against greatly preponderating numbers and resources. Reagan worried about whether the Confederacy had sufficient resources to defend Vicksburg and keep the Mississippi River open. I opposed the plan of crossing the Potomac and favored the plan of allowing General Lee to threaten such a movement without executing it, and, at the proper time, for 25,000 or 30,000 of his army to be sent to reinforce General Pemberton at Vicksburg. When he discovered that none of the other cabinet members supported transferring troops to Mississippi, Reagan abandoned the idea. While I had very decided views on this subject, I had to yield. I could not expect, on such an occasion, to overrule the opinion of great military men like President Davis and General Lee. During the ongoing discussions, various cables arrived urging the reinforcement of Pemberton at Vicksburg. Davis brought these to the attention of the cabinet and asked the members to reconvene the next morning to consider the question. "This encouraged me," continued Reagan. "We met early the next day and remained in session after dark in the evening in the anxious consideration of the questions involved in the campaign of 1863. This ended with the conclusion that General Lee should cross the Potomac and threaten Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, and that General J.E. Johnston should gather such forces and supplies as he could in the Gulf States and go to the relief of General Pemberton." The displeased Reagan remained firm in his belief that a great error had been made. After a sleepless night, he wrote a note to the President telling him, in substance, that I felt so strongly that we had made a great mistake that I had not slept during the night, and asking him to again convene the cabinet and reconsider that question. Davis responded, indicating that he would do so the next morning, but such a meeting never took place. It was not reconvened because before he had sent out his call for the cabinet, nearly all the members of it met in his office, and it at once appeared that it would be useless to attempt a further consideration of that subject. Another reason driving Lee's decision was his concern that the Confederate government might not be able to supply his army if it remained in the vicinity of Fredericksburg. Both armies had spent the winter and spring there, exhausting the area's resources, including fodder for horses and mules. The commissary department was only able to provide 1,800 calories of food per man per day to the Army of Northern Virginia during the previous winter months. Lee's complaint prompted an unsympathetic Commissary General Lucius Northrop to shoot back, "If General Lee wants rations, let him get them in Pennsylvania." Lee was, by nature, a gambler. He understood that if he did not seize the initiative, sooner or later Hooker, or some other successor in command of the Army of the Potomac, would make another move on his army and Richmond. As Confederate Brigadier General John B. Gordon later put it, "In the logistics of defensive war, offensives are often the wisest strategy." Lee's military secretary, Colonel Charles C. Marshall, wrote, "If General Lee remained inactive, both Vicksburg and Richmond would be imperiled, whereas if he were successful north of the Potomac, both would be saved." According to Armistead Long, Lee's secretary and future biographer, the general intended to march into Maryland and then Pennsylvania. Once there, he might threaten the state capital of Harrisburg and perhaps even march on Philadelphia. He hoped to fight and win a major battle north of the Mason-Dixon line and force the peace-leaning elements of the Democratic Party and the war-weary Northern citizenry to press President Abraham Lincoln's administration into peace negotiations. Lee's soldiers mostly echoed their beloved commander's confidence that the time was right for another invasion of the North. James James Caldwell, a lieutenant in the 1st South Carolina, typified the prevailing attitude. He had little doubt that we had now the finest army ever marshaled on this side of the Atlantic, and one scarcely inferior to any Europe has known. Although Lee only had some 60,000 men at the time, most were veterans of many campaigns and battles, sufficiently disciplined to obey orders promptly and with energy, yet preserving enough of the proud individuality of Southern men to feel the cause our own, and therefore to be willing to encounter the greatest amount of personal danger and moral responsibility. In Caldwell's opinion, the Confederates enjoyed excellent health, were better equipped than previously, and had a tower of strength in their commander. Some of Lee's men longed for a chance to repay Northerners for atrocities Union soldiers had inflicted upon the South. Major General Lafayette McLaws, one of Longstreet's veteran division commanders, penned a note to his wife speculating about the objectives of the summer campaign. "If we are striking for Pennsylvania," he declared, "we are actuated by a desire to visit upon the enemy some of the horrors of war, to give the Northern people some idea of the excesses committed by their troops upon our houses and inhabitants." Lee and his lieutenants spent several days perfecting their operational plan while putting the logistics in place to support an invasion. 2 divisions of Longstreet's corps, marching from a lengthy detached assignment in Suffolk, had rejoined the Army of Northern Virginia with tons of food and other supplies gathered from foraging missions in southeast Virginia. Lee's army still manned the lines around Fredericksburg and along the Rappahannock River that had marked the dividing line between the Union and Confederate armies for all of 1863. He reviewed the troops of Major Generals Jubal Early's and Edward Johnson's divisions near Fredericksburg on May 27. "After the review, we returned to camp much exhausted from standing so long in the sun," groused Lieutenant John H. Stone of the 2nd Maryland Battalion. Lee's army was clearly preparing for a large-scale campaign. Colonel George H. Sharp, the head of the Army of the Potomac's Bureau of Military Information, and his operatives were keeping an eye on these activities. On the same day Stone and his comrades marked time under a hot sun, Sharp reached a chilling conclusion. The Confederates were planning to commence a summer campaign of long marches and hard fighting in a part of the country where they would have no railroad transportation. He postulated that they would move in a northwesterly direction to fall upon the right flank of the Union Army, or, worse, march somewhere to the north of it. Sharp's assessment was spot on. Lee intended to begin the movement of his army on June 3, with Ewell's 2nd Corps leading the way. Information on possible Confederate movements was critical. Trained observers in hot-air balloons floating high above the Union lines provided a source of intelligence. They tracked changes in the Confederate positions using powerful field glasses. "We see the Yankees in balloons every day, reconnoitering our lines," Private Louis Leon of the 53rd North Carolina scrawled in his diary. On June 1, Lee met with his 3 corps commanders, Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill, to explain his plans. Culpeper was his first objective, and what followed remained flexible, depending upon how Hooker responded to the Army of Northern Virginia's movements. Lee intended to head north on Hooker's right flank, with Ewell's corps leading the advance and Longstreet's corps following. The cavalry was to move on the right flank to the east, which would hopefully force Hooker to withdraw from Stafford Heights as Jeb Stuart's horsemen threatened his rear. General Lee and his trio of corps leaders climbed Telegraph Hill in Fredericksburg on June 2 and carefully scanned the Army of the Potomac's camps at Falmouth, searching for signs that a shift toward Richmond was in the works. Satisfied that Hooker had no such short-term plans, Lee decided to start sending his troops northward the next day. His men brimmed with confidence and determination. The Army of Northern Virginia was as tough and as efficient as any army of the same number ever marshaled on this planet, declared Colonel Ridden T. Bennett of the 14th North Carolina. Major General Henry Heth, one of Hill's division commanders, declared that there was not an officer or soldier in the Army of Northern Virginia who did not believe that it was possible to drive the Federal Army into the Atlantic Ocean. The Richmond Whig arrogantly reported that an artificial leg ordered some months ago awaits General Ewell's arriving in the city of Philadelphia. William R. Stilwell of the 53rd Georgia told his wife, "We leave tonight at dark. May God be with us and bless us everywhere we go and be with us. The object of going off after dark is to prevent the Yankees from knowing of our movements. I suppose General Lee wants to deceive them. I don't like the idea of marching all night, but whether I like it or not, I have to lump it." All 7 brigades of the Army's cavalry began to gather in Culpeper County in anticipation of the opening of the march north. Their activities proved to be an irresistible target for their Federal counterparts, who remained active and diligent in their search for opportunities to strike a blow.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?